Why, hello there, old sports. Now, at the moment, I've been working on a concept for a small Hollow Knight RPG fan game on and off here and there. And despite the fact that this is a non-canon fan project that will inevitably become outdated when new content from Team Cherry comes out, I want it to remain somewhat accurate to the canon. So I've been spending a lot of time reading dialogue from both Silksong and Hollow Knight off the wiki because I'm too lazy to replay the entire game for 2 lines of dialogue. And after a couple days of reading and researching, a question came to my mind. Silksong is confirmed to take place after Hollow Knight, but by how much? How long after Hollow Knight does Silksong take place? We know from the Sister of the Void ending in Silksong that Silksong comes after Hollow Knight chronologically, and this is due to the fact that we see the knight in a state it can only reach after getting the Void Heart. Now, regardless of if you think Embrace the Void or Dream No More is canon, both endings require the Void Heart to be reached, and that means some form of the game's events must have happened before this. But other than this appearance of the knight, and the fact we play as Hornet, Silksong tends to ignore a lot of events from Hollow Knight most of the time. Now, some things like Void or Lifeblood seem to be universal forces of the Hollow Knight world, so even if we were introduced to them in Hollow Knight, they don't seem to be unique to Hallownest itself. But we don't see or hear much of stuff from the first game in the sequel, which does make sense considering the game takes place in a far-off kingdom, and Hornet is kind of occupied with Farloom shenanigans to speak of Hallownest, beyond a comment to Lace that alludes to the game's events here or there. Now, I'm simultaneously happy and frustrated about this. On one hand, I'm glad we don't spend most of our time in Farloom ignoring this new world for the sake of treading already covered ground just for the sake of fan service. But on the other hand, I feel like beyond 1 or 2 topics, we don't get to learn more about the wider world, ignoring a few implications that some subjects may be explored later, like the City of Steel and its scions. Now, of course, Silksong isn't a truly completed game, since we know at least 1 DLC is on the way, with potentially more to follow. So there's a chance that the DLC might explore some things from Hallownest in some shape or form, but I'm not going to hold my breath. You might be wondering why it matters how long after Hollow Knight Silksong takes place, so I'll explain my thought process. Now, Hornet is implied to have a greatly lengthened, if not endless natural lifespan, so since Hornet doesn't have any crow's feet, or I guess craw's feet in this case, we have no idea if it's been a year since Hollow Knight, or a decade. Hell, it could be a millennium and we'd be none the wiser, because Hornet does not visibly age. The White Lady says that the Hollow Knight was chained in the temple for ages, and while this is intentionally vague, an age tends to be a very long time in storytelling. We can see that Hornet looked similar to her current day appearance before the disappearance of the Pale King in his palace, so it's possible she grew and reached her final or mature form pretty quickly. But again, this requires some assumptions, so please keep that in mind. So, I guess my point here is that Hornet seems to have had a similar appearance for a long time within universe, so it's not like we can look to her to see how long time as between the games were. So, I could also see Team Cherry using this fact to leave the door open for different storytelling possibilities in the future. On top of that, the knight's appearance doesn't seem to do much for us either, since vessels only seem to grow and age under very specific circumstances, like the Hollow Knight, which is specifically noted to have been raised to prime form. And like I said, those are really the only 2 characters from Hollow Knight we see in Silksong, at least in the present. There is one other character from Hollow Knight that we see in Silksong, sort of, and that finally leads me to the main point of this video. Now, I am aware that that is an interesting chapter title, so please let me explain myself. I will admit, this is kind of a crackpot theory, but I don't know, I just thought this was a fun idea to share. Well, or I guess calling it fun is kind of awkward considering the circumstances. But what if the White Lady has passed away by the time of Silksong? We know the White Lady does in fact age, because even by the time of the events of Hollow Knight, she admits herself that she's gone blind due to the passage of time. So I feel like if her body can degrade enough to lose sight, it could also degrade enough to die. Greyroot seems to be a similar type of creature to the White Lady, though whether she's divine is up in the air. And we know she needs to do some sort of renewal ritual to keep herself alive, even if it is more of a reincarnation kind of deal. We also know that the Heart of Grimm needs to do something similar, so there is a precedent set that some gods in this world might need to do something like that to keep themselves alive, or at least in their prime, or at least powerful enough to continue exerting their will over other bugs. We also know that the White Lady has isolated herself for a long time in the cocoon in the Queen's Gardens, so if she did have to do some sort of ritual to keep herself alive, there's a good chance she hasn't, especially when she was hiding in there for the specific reason of hiding from both the infection and the mantis traders. But that by itself doesn't mean much. All I have established is that it's possible for the White Lady to die, not that she actually has. But this is where the red memory comes into play. Everything we see in the red memory seems to be far gone. Now, before moving forwards, what I'm about to explain is my interpretation of what we see in the red memory, so if I'm dumb and got something wrong, please tell me. But then again, this is supposed to be kind of an abstract, nebulous thing. Obviously, Hornet isn't physically going in between the hive and the palace, which are all connected to Deep Nest, and you get what I mean. It's not meant to be taken completely literally, so there is some room for interpretation here and there. Something that stood out to me when first seeing the red memory is that Hornet can barely even remember her mother's mask, let alone her face. So, since we know Hornet visited Hera's resting place up until her destruction by the Knight, it might mean there's been a long time since Hornet has even seen her mother, even if it was just her comatose body, and even if that just means that, she knows what the mask looks like, but she can barely remember what the mask looks like on her mother's face, if that makes any sense. On top of that, even if we're doing the ritual with the old hearts to get a more stable Everbloom that won't implode at the slightest touch, the fact that Hornet doesn't even consider trying to contact the White Lady about the flower kinda confuses me, but that isn't the biggest thing ever. Hornet doesn't even mention or acknowledge the White Lady until the deepest part of the red memory, which is another thing that kinda sticks out to me. But something that sticks out to me even more is this specific line. Reach forth, child grown strong. Wrest it from this remembrance. Burn yourself free from our sad fate. Now, I'm probably reading into this too much, but the term remembrance stood out to me a lot. But it is a word with multiple meanings, so I decided to look at those meanings and attempt to see which one fits this quote the best. So in this case, to simplify my process, I thought it was meant to say that this is a special moment that Hornet was trying to honor. And I thought this because this is where Hornet was given an Everbloom flower. But I don't know if that's really the case. The White Lady doesn't even seem to have the flower until Hornet interrupts the memory and speaks of the present. Now, we know the White Lady can be aware of mind tampering, as seen with the Dreamnail and Hollow Knight, so I feel like it's not much of a leap to suggest that a higher being like herself could be cognizant within a memory as seen here. So it's possible she didn't even have the flower at the moment when this memory was actually taking place. Again, this whole sequence is kind of abstract, so please keep that in mind. My point is that this doesn't seem like a remembrance of a specific moment, so then I thought of another meaning of the term remembrance. Another meaning of the word is the idea of keeping something from the past alive in your memory, and this wouldn't make sense if the White Lady was alive, would it? Now again, I just want to state that this section is just a theory, and I could very well be wrong. I just wanted to bring up this idea to point out how much could have changed between Hollow Knight and Silksong. And from a storytelling standpoint, I feel like this idea also kind of makes sense. Because the red memory also kind of confirms the whole Daughter of Three Queens idea that was thrown around back before the game was complete, or the first Hollow Knight game was complete. And the thing about that is that obviously Silksong explores the themes of motherhood and just femininity a lot, so I feel like it makes sense that at this point, Hornet doesn't have any of her mother figures to rely on anymore. She has to carve her own path, and what she has to do is she has to take the wisdom from her mother figures or maternal figures and forge her own path with that instead of relying on them, hence why the only communication or mention of them she has is within a memory, which is her own interpretation of events, so it's still her carving her own path. Because I don't really like theories that only exist to be shocking, but I feel like this theory kind of has some grounding in the story that's trying to be told, So I feel like that gives it a teensy bit more legitimacy and makes this theory go from just completely ridiculous to only slightly ridiculous. But I digress. Now you may be wondering what the point of all of this is. Even if these games take place hundreds of years apart, or 10 years apart, why does that matter? Most of the important characters in this series have long lives, and characters passing away between entries is nothing new in the realm of fiction, obviously. Hell, even in Hollow Knight, Ogrim isn't been alive for ages. He's been alive since the fall of Hallownest, even though he seems to just be a normal bug. He's not a god of any sort, but he's been alive he's been alive longer than the Hollow Knight has, and thus alive longer than Elderbug. Now, those are all good points, and are completely valid concerns, but I think it's interesting that no specific timeline was established beyond the simple fact that Hollow Knight comes before Silksong. I feel like if it wasn't important, Team Cherry would have just established something, or would have had Hornet say, "It's been years since the problems of my kingdom have been solved," or something like that. But there wasn't anything, and I feel like that's just Team Cherry leaving the door open in case they want to explore anything, including the time between the games. But again, that's just me. Also, I guess to be a bit more meta, I feel like too many theorists in the gaming space focus too much on trying to solve a series, or come up with some sort of grand overarching answer for everything. And while there's nothing wrong with that, sometimes I feel like it's just okay to throw out ideas to get people discussing things. Not every lore discussion has to be so high stakes. Sometimes you can just cover some lighter topics, like an important character kicking the bucket. Okay, maybe I am going insane. Regardless, this was just an idea I had, and I tried to explore it and see if it had any validity, and here I am. Being honest, this video was kind of just an idea I had while working on some bigger projects, and I just decided to make it, and it doubles as kind of holding people over until one of my bigger projects is completed. Regardless, I would like to hear your thoughts on my theory down below in the comments, even if your idea is just ripping it to shreds. I appreciate that just as much as any praise you would give me, because at least that means I made something interesting enough to be interacted with. Anyways, I would like to thank my YouTube channel members, Wally73, Sven Biscuit, and Amarin98 for their continued financial support. It means the world to me. And of course, any support given by anyone else means just as much. Thank you for your time watching this video today. It means a lot, and I guess I'm gonna get back to working on some other projects, which may also be theory related. See you all soon.